Antizionism and the Othering of American Jews with Shaul Kelner. Shaul Kelner will talk about the damaging impact of the anti-Zionist movement on American Jews. Shaul Kelner is a professor of Jewish studies and sociology at Vanderbilt University. He specializes in the sociology of contemporary American Jewish life. His recent book, A Cold War Exodus: How American Activists Mobilized to Free Soviet Jews, written with grant support from the National Endowment for the Humanities, won a National Jewish Book Award. He has been a Fellow of the Hebrew University of Jerusalem's Institute for Advanced Studies and the University of Michigan's Frankel Institute for Advanced Judaic Studies, and served as a board member of the Association for Jewish Studies and of the Association for the Social Scientific Study of Jewry. His first book, Tours That Bind, Diaspora, Pilgrimage, and Israeli Birthright Tourism, won the Association for Jewish Studies' inaugural Jordan Schnitzer Book Award. During the COVID-19 pandemic, Vanderbilt's College of Arts and Science recognized him with an Innovative Teaching Award for creating engaging, in-person learning environments.
My name is Elise Martel-Cohen, and I am in the Sociology Department at Loyola University, Chicago. I suppose one could say that after October 7th, I was a reluctant sociologist. That is until I met David Hirsch and the other fine folks, fine humans at the London Center for the Study of Contemporary Anti-Semitism, and I am now a fellow. It is my pleasure to welcome you to today's online seminar. These seminars are part of the LCSCA's Community of Scholarship, a place where fellows, post-grad fellows, other scholars, as well as the wider public can engage with each other's work, research, and ideas. These seminars nurture communities of scholarship and wider communities of support. Today, I'm so pleased to welcome Dr. Shaul Kelner, who will present his work on the topic of anti-Zionism and the othering of American Jews, a topic that I am sure many of us in attendance have some personal experience with, both outside the academy as well as within. Just today, I was reading in the Times of Israel about the 60-page report published by the National Communication Association's Task Force on Academic Freedom and Tenure, in which they declared that Zionists are engaging alongside white supremacists in efforts to undermine academic freedom. Now, Dr. Kelner will talk about the damaging impact of anti-Zionist movement on American Jews, and will be applying sociological lenses to analyze anti-Zionism as an American mass movement. Professor Kelner is a professor of Jewish studies and sociology at Vanderbilt University. He specializes in the sociology of contemporary American Jewish life. His recent book, A Cold War Exodus: How American Activists Mobilized to Free Soviet Jews, written with grant support from the National Endowment of the Humanities, won a National Jewish Book Award. He has been a fellow of Hebrew University, of Jerusalem's Institute for Advanced Studies, and the University of Michigan's Frankel Institute for Advanced Judaic Studies, and served as well as a board member of the Association for Jewish Studies and the Association for the Social Scientific Study of Jewry. His first book, Tours That Bind, Diaspora, Pilgrimage, and Israeli Birthright Tourism, won the Association for Jewish Studies inaugural Jordan Schnitzer Book Award. And during the COVID pandemic, Vanderbilt's College of Arts and Sciences recognized him with an Innovative Teaching Award for creating engaging in-person learning environments. So without further delay, let's welcome Dr. Kelner. And Dr. Kelner will speak for about 45 minutes, at which point we will open up for questions. After that, we'll conclude with some announcements about exciting upcoming events. But now let's turn our attention to this exciting current event and welcome Dr. Shaul Kelner.
Thank you. Thank you, Elise. Thank you, Joe. Thank you, Liz. And let me say thank you to the entire center. I'm excited to be here. I'm also excited to be here as one of the two talks that start with the word anti-Zionism with next week's being Adam Lewis Klein's, whose work I respect enormously. So I view this as a double billing in a way, and I'm really, really excited to be on the bill with him. So I'm going to talk about American anti-Zionism. And for those of you who are not in the States, one of the things I would be curious to hear about is to what extent this story is not solely an American story, the ways in which the experience in the States is differing from the experience in different countries in Europe and elsewhere. So I want to begin with going back in time, actually to 1968. And Leon Poliakov, who I would imagine many of you know of or have read, he had just finished the third volume of his magnum opus, this massive 4-volume history of anti-Semitism. And that volume ends, it's from Voltaire to Wagner. And he ends that book, 1968, saying, "Historians are not prophets, and I will refrain finally from making any prognosis. Only the future will show if and to what degree a hatred of the Jews, justified theologically until the French Revolution and racially until the Hitlerite Holocaust, will have a third incarnation under a new anti-Jewish guise." But he does not refrain for long. He actually then takes a break from writing the 4th volume of the history of anti-Semitism to write a small text published in French and German, de l'antizionisme à l'antisemitisme, from anti-Zionism to anti-Semitism. And there he answers the question. He gives he already gives the prognosis. He says, "Under the pretext of a critical attitude toward the Jewish state and its supporters, an ancient passion inspired by hatred continues to make its way. He says the devil painted on the wall has swapped his name from Jewish conspiracy to Zionist conspiracy." And the title, of course, of the book telegraphs what the argument is that he's making. This ancient passion inspired by hatred continues to make its way. However, it does so in different ways, depending on the region and the regime. And what I want to focus on here is the region and the regime that anti-Zionism is now, I'll say, flourishing under in the United States. What I'll be speaking about, I want to say, is going to be framed by my own experiences in the academy with academic anti-Zionism, going all the way back to the 1990s when I was warned against entering anthropology as a Zionist, Israel-connected Jew. I was told, you're not going to find a place for yourself there. That's one of the reasons that I chose sociology. But also the lenses that I'm going to apply will be those of a sociologist who studies social movements and social movement activism, and a historian who has studied the movement to fight anti-Zionism in the Soviet Union. And so those are the perspectives that I'm bringing. And when I think about this as a sociologist, you might see, I'll be thinking about these in different terms. I know that I just quoted Poliakov, who was talking about anti-Semitism as a hatred. I'm not thinking about this in psychological terms. I don't see this phenomenon, either the phenomenon of anti-Semitism or of anti-Zionism, as something that can be reduced to psychological states, to emotions. I see these as political, collective phenomena, social behaviors, and the like, and that's how I'm going to be analyzing them. So, if we think about the regimes under which American anti-Zionism has grown and is now flourishing, I think it's important to recognize that the models that we have to think about anti-Zionism in other places tend to be focused on governmental anti-Zionism. So if we think about anti-Zionism in the Soviet context or in the Iranian context, there is a central government that is making the state policy, and the policy is devolving from there. And in contrast to that, anti-Zionism in the United States is not being led by any central authority. It's not being led by any central governmental authority. It's coordinated by activist networks, and it advances Polyakov says in regimes, I'll say in petty regimes here. And so what are these petty regimes? We see anti-Zionism advancing in scholarly associations, in student unions, in publishing houses, school boards, local school boards, grocery co-ops, city councils. We'll see now, we'll have to keep our eyes on New York and see to what extent anti-Zionism will be advancing through the mayor's office as well. But the point to keep in mind here is that as a political phenomenon, this is manifesting at the local level, it's manifesting sporadically, and it's not via a unified national policy. And I think that one of the things that makes American anti-Zionism an American movement is that fact that it's been devolved down to local government and to civil society. And it's one of the adaptations that I think has allowed anti-Zionism to take hold and to begin to thrive here in the States. And I want to be clear on what's happening. We now have in the US a mass movement that is premised on denying and undoing political rights that Jews have already secured. And this movement to deny and undo Jewish political rights has already been expressing itself at the governmental level. We're not going to see it right now. We don't see it right now at the national level, but we have seen it at the local level. We've seen it in city councils. We've seen it in school boards. So this is not solely a non-governmental phenomenon. It has already entered the realm of government. And this is new for American Jews, certainly for American Jews who were born after World War II. I'll say it's not a coincidence that Polyakov's book is written in Europe, because in Europe, political questions have been, the questions of political debate and political rights have organized themselves around Jewish questions for a long time. And that's really not been the case in the US. And in the US, when we've thought about challenges to Jewish political rights, we have assumed first that that's a relic of the past, that the status of Jews as equal citizens was in question at various points in the 1800s and early 1900s, but now that's past. And we also largely assumed that it followed a specific model, and that's the model of Father Coughlin, Charles Lindbergh, the Ku Klux Klan, etc. That is to say, a challenge to individual Jewish civic rights, and a challenge that's based on racial claims, based on religious claims, coming from the political right. And what American Jews, and certainly younger American Jews, but I think I would say most alive today, really have not been prepared for is an energetic mass movement, a youth-led mass movement that is committed, and not for racial reasons, and ostensibly for reasons of social justice, but committed to the notion that the principle of equal rights and self-determination of peoples should no longer apply to Jews. If the critiques of Israel and the protests against the war in Gaza had confined themselves to critiques of Israel and protests about war, and did not embrace the language of anti-Zionism, critiques of Zionism, American Jews might have been able to retain their balance a little bit more. But essentially, we're in a situation now where a growing portion of the American public has deemed problematic not the exercise of Israeli state power, but Jews' claim to have a right to self-determination, to have a right to state power in the first place. And that, I think, is the difference. So the question that, for me, as someone who studies social movements, is how does this emerge? How does such an antagonistic politics actually emerge in the US? So I've been immersed in social movement studies since I began doing research on activism to free Soviet Jews. And so my thinking about this is really shaped through those sociological lenses. And it leads me to think of anti-Zionism and to see anti-Zionism as something that is defined more by its actions than by its arguments. And that's a point that I'm going to develop through this talk. So what does it mean that anti-Zionism is something that is defined by its actions more than by its arguments. I guess the simple way of saying it is anti-Zionism is what anti-Zionism does. Every social movement will have its intellectuals who are trying to codify what is the movement about, what are the ideologies, what are the beliefs, what are the principles. And sometimes the people who are writing the manifestos and the books and the like are leading the movement. Sometimes they're being led by the street, but there's a loose connection. And in no case, in no political movement, can you see it as something where what is written in the book dictates everything that's going to happen in the movement itself. The movement, once it takes to the streets, you get mass collective action. People do their own thing, and there's a gap inevitably between the movement as a sociological, social phenomenon and the ideology that the intellectuals who are writing for the movement will say this thing is about. By the way, I'm not the first person to say this. Our rabbis said this. They were talking about something different, but in rabbinic tradition, they'll interpret the saying, the line in Exodus where Moses, where God is presenting the law to the Israelites, and Moses is transmitting to them, and they say, "Na'aseh v'nishma," we will do and we will understand. And the rabbis say that doesn't make sense. You should say we will understand it and then we will do it. But the text says no, we will do and we will understand. The doing is going to come first. The meaning will emerge from the doing. The rabbis, of course, are going to insist that if the text says this in this word order, it means something. I, as a sociologist, read it as a very good rabbinic sociology that understands that meanings themselves produce actions. And just because something is written doesn't mean that that's how that's going to play out in real life. In social movement terms, they'll talk about it as praxis, which is the lived reality of the movement. So think about it this way. From the perspective of the intellectuals who are saying this anti-Zionism is a critique of Zionism, there's no reasoned critique of Lillian Bloom or Beryl Katz-Nelson or the like. And by the way, that's one of the reasons that I'm spelling it, that I adopt the spelling of all lowercase, no hyphen. Anti-Zionism is best understood not by studying Zionism. Anti-Zionism is best understood by studying anti-Zionists, what they do, and more what they do than what it is that they write. So we really want to see what's happening on the streets to see what anti-Zionism is as a lived social movement. You want to borrow from what the East Germans used to say. They had their actually existing socialism. Well, there's an actually existing anti-Zionism, and that is the practices that you see among anti-Zionist protesters, be they on campuses or in front of synagogues, or the ones who you see the image here, throwing firebombs or the like. It's whatever is being done in the name of anti-Zionism, that's what anti-Zionism is. And that's what we really need to try to understand. Now, what that means is that anti-Zionism is bigger than a set of ideas. And, like it or not, give credit where it's due. It is a world-altering political phenomenon. And any Jew who has felt even the smallest bit affected by the changed political context knows that that's true. And that's whether they choose to tuck in a Magen David, or they choose not to mention that they had been to Israel, or they second guess whether they're going to apply to a certain university, or on the other hand, they decide that they're going to go seek out Jewish community for the first time. The reality on the ground has been reshaped. And it's been reshaped not by the texts that are in the books, but by the protests that are on the streets and the things that are actually happening out there, the ways that people are actually being treated. All right, so what is it that they're doing? Say anti-Zionism is what anti-Zionism is what anti-Zionism does. So what is it that anti-Zionism does, and how can we study this? Great. As a sociologist, I'd say this is the perfect area for sociology to come and investigate. And if the discipline itself were not compromised in some ways, and that's part of the issue of anti-Zionism in academia, we might see more studies that would look at anti-Zionism in this way rather than participate and just stand back and analyze it. So I'm going to try to stand back and analyze what I'm seeing in an anti-Zionist social movement using social movement lenses. So First, movements make themselves sustainable by building a culture. They gather people together, they unite them, they create a shared culture, and that culture is something that will help to sustain the movement. Which means, by the way, that just because the fighting in the Middle East is for now thankfully subsided, it does not mean that we're going to see an end to the anti-Zionist movement. They have built up an institutional base. They've created a movement culture, and they have the basis to continue moving forward from here. We're going to have to see how they do that. But if we look at the types of behaviors that they engage in, here the repertoire is familiar. And I'll say this, and you know the litany, and you probably could recite it too. So American anti-Zionism involves things like encampments, occupations, particularly of university spaces, boycotts of Israeli scholars, of artists, boycotts not just of Israelis, but also boycotts of select American Jewish groups as well. So boycotts of Hillel, boycotts of the Anti-Defamation League. That is to say, it's not just a boycott of things Israeli, it's a boycott of anything that is defined as Zionist, including American Jewish people and institutions. The repertoire includes masked harassment of Jews, particularly Jewish students. It includes defacement of Jewish property. It includes destruction of Jewish property. Anti-Zionism in the States includes disruption of performances by Jewish musicians and artists and so forth. Like other movements, at the extreme, it also manifests in political violence. And Jews and Israelis in the US have fallen victim to anti-Zionist physical assault, firebombing, and shooting. And although the violence has been committed specifically in the name of the movement's ideals, I think it's probably better to understand this not as a consensus part of the movement's strategic repertoire. There will be many anti-Zionists will say, "Oh, no, we don't support the violence. We don't support the violence." I think it's better understood as an indication of the success of the anti-Zionist movement in defining an enemy. For those in the movement who want to commit violence, they know who to target. Anti-Zionist praxis, their na'aseh v'nishma, in the States also involves rituals and symbols and behaviors that are community building. So, for example, the chants, and you know probably the most common chant where they will say, "Free, free Palestine." The shooter in the Capitol Jewish Museum in May 2025, who murdered Sarah Lynn Milgram and Yaron Lashinsky, Zichronam Livracha, when he shot them, he was alone, but he shouted the chant. He didn't say "Free Palestine." He said, "Free, free Palestine," as he was being arrested. And so the question to the sociologists here is, well, that's an odd way of phrasing it. If you want to say "Free Palestine," just say "Free Palestine." Why are you adding that second "free"? Free, free Palestine. And for that, go get a theater professor in here or a poetry professor who can tell you how this scans. Well, I went to my uncle who happens to be a theater and poetry professor. I asked him, what are the what are the rhythms here? And he said, listen to it. It's a spondee and a dactyl. Spondee, flee, flee. The dactyl, Palestine. Flee, flee, Palestine. And that rhythm creates something that can be chanted. It's much more melodious and to the ear, and it's also much more effective when you're going to be chanting this as a collective, as a group. But it has ingrained itself so much into movement culture that even when someone was alone and committing violence in the name of anti-Zionism, they still did the chant in that way. So that shows you that what you're looking at here is this is not simply a political movement. This is a movement that has culture, and that's one of the ways that you can see that culture is there. Second, we have the symbolic dress. Here you can look at the image, the keffiyeh, the way that the keffiyeh has been adopted and appropriated by people who themselves are not Palestinian. They're embracing it to show solidarity with Palestinians, but they're doing something more with that. They're also showing solidarity with each other, with other protesters within the movement. So this becomes part. You're seeing white kids, of no religion or formerly Protestant or the like, dressing in keffiyehs. This is asserting solidarity also with each other and not just with Palestinians. So you have symbolic dress, and then you have a ritualized othering. And I'm going to draw on some research both from sociology and, shocker, from anthropology to try to understand what's going on. Okay, so if you ask people who are promoting boycotts, and I want to leave aside divestment and sanctions, keep that separate, all this probably will apply for that too, but just the act of boycotting itself, when you ask them why are they doing what they're doing, they will say that the boycott is a tried and true method of nonviolent social action to put pressure on a government or an institution to change policy, and that's what they're trying to do. Okay, maybe, okay, but there's something more to this. There's a great sociologist, was a great sociologist named Robert Merton, and he came up with lots of classic sociological concepts. If you've ever heard of the self-fulfilling prophecy, that's Merton. Well, he did a study, I think this was back in the 1950s, where he was talking about the manifest and latent functions of social behavior. And so the way that he explained it is that every social behavior has its officially declared purpose. Take education, for example. The officially declared purpose of education, we have several of them. One is to pass down the knowledge of the generations. Another is to prepare the young to take jobs and to be good citizens. That's the manifest purpose. But there's also always a latent function, an underlying function in social behaviors that are unrecognized, but that are important to constitute what these behaviors actually are and what they're doing. In the case of education, latent functions of education will include things like sorting people by social class. We wouldn't say, oh, that's officially what we're trying to do. But that is an effect of the institution of education, and it's one of the ways that we perpetuate social class distinctions. Okay, this is a classic I would say social 101, but it's basic for an introductory theory class in sociology graduate school. Manifest functions, latent functions. Okay, and what we will hear from activists who are promoting boycotts will be the manifest functions. They're not going to speak about latent functions, either because they're not aware of them or because they're aware of them, but they really don't want to look too closely because it could be problematic. So what's going on here? The latent function of a boycott is to define, marginalize, exclude, ostracize, and other, capital O, other. By participating in a boycott, what one does is one essentially says, I'm going to draw a moral line. I'm going to put the people that will be boycotted on the other side of that moral line, and I and my fellow boycotters are on the good side of the moral line. So there's a difference between actually doing the boycott and the public declaration of doing the boycott. You can have instances, and I'm sure this is happening, where people are very quietly choosing themselves personally to boycott things Israeli or Jews or the like. And this could be shopping at the co-op or at the food store, or choosing not to review an academic journal article because it's dealing with an Israeli topic, or you suspect that the author is Jewish or Israeli. That's private; no one knows. But the public act of signing a declaration that we're going to boycott, or creating a petition to boycott, or trying to pass a city council resolution for a boycott is that you are building community around the act of exclusion, of excluding this group that's being defined as an other. And so in that sense, for the movement itself, the public act of declaring the boycott is much more important than whether or not the Israelis and Israeli goods and people or the like are actually being isolated or actually being boycotted. It's the act of creating a public situation where a group is being defined as other, untouchable, ostracized, outside of the community of moral concern, and at the same time defining the people who are doing that as the community of the good. So this is something that talk to people who are doing the boycott, this is not how they will frame it. This is, when we apply sociological lenses to what's going on, of course there are deeper meanings to human behavior than just what people say they're doing. We know that. Anthropology this is a basic premise of the whole discipline of anthropology, right? That human behavior is coded with multiple layers of meaning, and it's the job of the anthropologist to uncover what that is. So, there's a classic anthropological study written by Mary Douglas called Purity and Danger. The subtitle is An Analysis of the Concept of Pollution and Taboo. And what she's studying there is how human beings have this penchant for dividing the world into opposing categories of purity and defilement, good, bad, clean, dirty, and then policing those boundaries. And I know I understand the irony of using anthropology, the discipline of anthropology, to analyze the boycott itself, considering that the American Anthropological Association has done probably more than any other of the large academic associations to normalize the practice of boycott. But just because the failings of the scholarly association don't negate the insights of the discipline itself. And, at some point, people might look back and try to study the AAA and see, did they not understand what they were doing? Or did they understand their discipline only too well and use it very effectively to define Jews as on the other side of this boundary? So that's how we see movement culture happening. They're building a culture of solidarity amongst themselves that's based on defining an enemy, defining an other, and symbolically excluding. And that's very much done in the public square. The culture itself also will include language, and that's of course standard. Human beings, we're cultural beings, and we speak in language. The mutual unintelligibility of foreign languages is one of the things that keeps cultures distinct. So as anti-Zionists are trying to build their own movement culture, they create their own language and they're putting it out into the public square. And this language that they're putting out into the public square has consequences for American Jews. And I would say, as much as anything else, it has created the environment of hostility where Jews have basically been put in a situation of having to make decisions. Are they going to closet themselves, or are they going to come out and stand up for themselves? How are they going to behave? So we'll often talk about what happened, the Hamas attack, as just by its date, October 7th, right? The same. That's probably something that goes back to 9/11, where we use the date to refer to the attack. Hamas did not refer to the attack as October 7th. They referred to the attack as Operation Al-Aqsa Flood, and that's the name that first came out. The name was known, when they first, when they first launched the attack. And what happens immediately is that this language of flood it goes international. And the protests of solidarity on October 8th, 2023, and in that month of October, around the world they immediately use the word flood. And that language has stayed with the movement. Here you're seeing a poster from 2024, Flood New York City for Gaza. Why flood? Why is the flood language so prevalent? The flood language is prevalent because Hamas named the attack the Al-Aqsa Flood. So if you are in New York on October the 7th and October the 8th, and you want to symbolically participate in the attack, you adopt the name, you embrace the name. And that's exactly what happened. And that language is out there, but you'll hear Jews using the term flood. At some point, there was, I think it was February, March, at some point earlier this year, we must flood Gaza with aid and with food. So the language of flood has now been normalized. Its origins have been masked, largely forgotten, and that allows this language to continue to be out there. The people who wrote this poster, Flood New York City for Gaza, they know very well why they're using the word flood. They're not in the Al-Nukba force, but they're doing the best that they can do from New York or Chicago or San Francisco, wherever it is that they're doing it, by using this language. That's one. Second, if you take a look at the posters that had come out immediately after the Al-Aqsa flood attack, you will see the pictures of the Hamas paraglider or representations of that over here in the States. So what's going on with that? So this is something that African Americans are certainly aware of. When a noose is being, when a noose is shown to threaten blacks in the States, the reason that the noose is used as a symbol of threat is because this was the means of murder that had been used in lynchings. So the noose itself is it's been used in lots of ways for lots of things, but it's specific association with lynchings that makes it a potent symbol. By using a symbol of murder past, you can threaten in the present. That happens also with the hissing sound that white supremacists will make when they're walking by Jews. And for those who don't know of that, that's the hissing sound is the hissing of gas for gas chambers. So having the symbol of the Hamas paraglider is using the symbol of the Al-Aqsa flood attack itself in the protests as a way both of asserting solidarity, but also of symbolically embracing violence. And this was being done. These images were being shown, before the dead were tallied, and American Jews are in enormous, enormous pain. And these are the images that are being put out. Of course, it's plausibly deniable. And that's the advantage of all this, of the paraglider symbol, of the flood language, of the term globalize the intifada. Intifada, it just means struggle. It does not just mean, nothing just means. The term polysemy means essentially multiple meanings. And we know that language and symbols always contain multiple meanings. So using this type of language, essentially coded language, enables protesters in the anti-Zionist movement here to bring in a coded language of violence and at the same time to have plausible deniability. So they can speak to their own audiences and they can speak to public audiences who would be appalled by this, and say, no, we didn't mean that. But of course, that meaning is always there. And Jews understand it. And that's one of the reasons that they can feel threatened. And then they have to deal with the on top of that, their sense of being threatened then gets denied because no, of course, that's not what the symbols mean. This to me was one of the more disheartening aspects of what happened on the campuses, because our job as academics, at least those in the humanities and social sciences, is to teach sensitivity to nuances of language and meaning. And so either this was a failure, an intellectual failure, we didn't recognize it, or it was a moral failure. People recognized it, but they still chose to embrace it. And the fact that we see this stuff happening at universities is one of the real black marks on the American Academy in these past 2 years. Okay, so how did we get here? I'll say we have a problem. The problem is a sample of one. There was a fantastic sociologist named Howard Becker. He wrote a great book called Tricks of the Trade, which is a research methods book. It doesn't tell you how to do t-tests or statistics. Basically, what it will tell you to do is how to think. And one of the things that he says is, and I'm quoting him, every scientific enterprise tries to find out something that will apply to everything of a certain kind by studying a few examples from which we hope to generalize. And then he says, but that's a problem. Why is it a problem? Because the part may not represent the whole as we would like to think it does. So if you have a sample of, he gives an example of, he was studying medical schools, he studied the University of Kansas. People said, why aren't you studying Harvard Medical School? And because there's a bias toward it. He said, look, if you're only studying the Ivies, you're missing most of what's going on in the States. But people continue to go back to study canonical cases and ignore the vast diversity. So how does this relate? Well, we have a sample of one problem. We have canonical case bias. If we think about how in the States we have been educating both ourselves, Jews and Jewish children, and Americans and American youth more generally, we have essentially given one case, and that is the case of racist, race-based Nazi anti-Semitism as the sole way that Jews are othered. And that creates a really distorted understanding. And that's what led people who were participating in the encampments, who were shouting vile things about Jews, to think, no, but I'm anti-racist. So I cannot be, I'm not anti-Semitic because I'm not against Jews on racial grounds. And that distinction, I'm not anti-Semitic, I'm only anti-Zionist, that only becomes possible in a situation where one thinks that the only history of the othering of Jews comes from racist right-wing anti-Semites, and that's not the case. We have not educated Americans really at all about the history of Soviet anti-Zionism. There were two totalitarianisms in the 20th century, both of which had state policies that targeted Jews. One did it in the name of race, and the other did it in the name of fighting Zionism and fighting cosmopolitanism. And we teach about one of them. And so when the historical legacies of the other one jump over here, Metz, I would say, and begin to manifest, people who are inheriting this history are oblivious or ignorant of it. They have no idea because we are not teaching it. So people say it's anti-Zionism, anti-Semitism, anti-Semitism, anti-Zionism. From my sense, I use the term anti-Semitism to refer to the race-based othering of Jews that's coming from the political right, and I use the term anti-Zionism to refer to the political othering of Jews in the name of anti-colonialism, anti-imperialism, and the like that's coming from the political left. And I would say, so is anti-Zionism or is not anti-Semitism? It's irrelevant, but say no, it's not anti-Semitism. In the American context today, anti-Zionism is worse for now. Why? That could change, by the way. Why? A few reasons. The first, I would say, is proximity. American Jews are living in communities where they're not interacting on a daily basis with people who embrace racial anti-Semitism. Part of that is America is very sorted along political lines and social class lines, and Jews as an urban, relatively upper class group. They're not. I live in Tennessee, but I'm in Nashville. It's a blue dot in a red state. We have neo-Nazi groups here. They're mostly outside in the rural areas. They're not here. When I'm encountering in blue Nashville, I'm much more likely to encounter an othering in the name of anti-Zionism than I am to encounter it in the name of anti-Semitism. And when the anti-Semites do come here to march in the downtown, they're coming from the outside to march. They don't live here. The anti-Zionists live here, and we interact on a regular basis. So one is the issue of proximity. Jews are simply more proximate to anti-Zionists than they are to anti-Semites, and therefore they're more likely to experience it personally in the places where they live, where they work, where they shop, where they play. Second is this educational vacuum. There is a stigma that's associated with anti-Semitism because we've taught the history of it well. But having not taught the history of anti-Zionism, there's no stigma attaches to it, which is why we will often mislabel anti-Zionist violence as anti-Semitic violence, because, well, at least there's a stigma that attaches to anti-Semitism. Now, if you spent a decade plus immersed in the study of Soviet anti-Zionism that I have, to me that term is stigmatized in and of itself. But I know that that I'm an exceptional case here. But there's an educational vacuum, and the history of anti-Zionism is not enough known so that it carries its own stigma. The third is intellectual legitimacy. People don't take anti-Semites seriously. People think that anti-Semites are a bunch of morons and thugs, and anti-Zionists, however, are professors, and they have books, and this is where the intellectual stuff does come into play. This anti-Zionism is rooted in universities, in places of high culture, and it has an intellectual legitimacy that anti-Semitism does not have. And if you are an academic and you don't believe that intellectual legitimacy is important, you should not be in academia. The ideas matter, and right now, anti-Zionism has the professor's anti-Semitism does not. And finally, you take all these things together, and you are seeing an institutionalization of anti-Zionism that in the States that you're not seeing with regard to anti-Semitism. And what that means is you don't have institutionalized anti-Semitic boycotts. You do have institutionalized anti-Zionist boycotts. The anti-Semites, the racist anti-Semites, are not going to the city council to pass resolutions condemning Jews. You do have anti-Zionists who are organized and are trying to turn their personal politics into public policy. So this is not you can say, look, but what do you say? I want to notice I did not use the word hate. I'm not talking about this in terms of an emotion, in terms of an inner state. We're talking about behavior, and this is a behavior that is othering Jews. There is one behavior of othering Jews that is intellectually legitimized, institutionalized, denied, and whose history is not known, and it's happening in spaces where Jews are actually living. And there's another one that's not. The only area where anti-Semitism probably has a leg up on anti-Zionism is with regard to the organized violence and the potential for organized violence. But we know from Washington and from Colorado and from other places that anti-Semites do not have a monopoly on this violence. Anti-Zionists have engaged in violence as well. All this, by the way, can change on a dime. There's a lot going on with the rise and the resurgence of classic religious and race-based anti-Semitism in the American Christian nationalist right. So I'm speaking for this moment in particular. And what can we do with that? Let me end here and then open to the questions. So first, I would say first is cognitive liberation. We just have to name both threats. Someone told me recently, yeah, that's why God gave you a neck, so you can look to the left and you can look to the right. I don't know which way my screen is facing, my image is facing, that's why I'm going to look in both directions. But there is an othering of Jews from both directions. I would simply say, if someone asks the question, anti-Semitism, anti-Zionism, yes, anti-Semitism is the othering of Jews from the political right. Anti-Zionism is the othering of Jews from the political left. All the rest is commentary. Now go fight them both. Second, we need educational reform, and that educational reform has to go beyond Holocaust centrism. I don't know how much it's going to be possible to affect American curricula more broadly. Certainly, it would make sense to start with American Jewish curricula, and that would be to expand the study of the othering of Jews beyond the Holocaust and beyond religious and race-based anti-Semitism. We need to have just as much equal curricular time for the study of anti-Zionism, and that can include Soviet anti-Zionism, it could include Iranian anti-Zionism and the like, but we need equal time for anti-Zionism on the curriculum alongside anti-Semitism. And the kids in the class of 2024 did not have that, but we need to make sure that the kids who are going in to the class of 2030 will, because anti-Zionism is not going away in the States. One of its strongholds is at the university. So Jewish students are going to confront it there. And we need to make sure that they are educationally prepared so that even if their professors don't know the history of this politics that they're perpetuating and complicit in, at least our students will know and will be able to call them out and to take them to task. And I'll stop there and open to questions.
Thank you so very much. Before we open it up to questions, I'm wondering if you might indulge me and allow me to ask a couple of questions or make a couple of comments. First, this was fantastic. Thank you so much. And it's people like you as a human and as a sociologist, who make me think that maybe I shouldn't flame out and quit my job. But in sociology, a couple of things, so many things pop to mind. But in thinking about the idea of, social justice or social movement, right? An energetic youth mass movement. I'm remembering habits of the heart, and I'm remembering the ideas of civil society and civil religion and the secular religion of today, which is social justice movement activism. And so I guess one comment or question, and I can save these for later, is just the idea about, how do you counter a movement that bills itself as rooted squarely within social justice activism, as, like, just as with the other strains of before, the different anti-Semitisms, whether it be based on religion or theology or race or whatnot, this falls within squarely a secular religious movement of social justice. And
Yep.
so I think that makes it all the more challenging. And maybe it's because I teach at a Jesuit university and whatnot, but it's fairly entrenched. That was one thing I just wanted to point out.
Do you want me to respond to that one?
Yeah, I mean, if you might, yeah, if that's okay.
Yeah. So here, it depends on who you're speaking to. There are ways to fight. There are different ways to fight social movements. If the goal is to convince people who are in the movement to rethink, which I think is an important part of the strategy, education is crucial. I think the work of Isabella Tabarovsky on this is going to be key, and others who are looking at the history of anti-Zionism. Basically, a lot of people got involved in this movement thinking that they were doing justice without realizing that they have been perpetuating a tradition that has a history of othering and oppressing Jews. And if they had known that, the movement still would have happened, but there would have been a chunk of people who said, "I'm not joining that." So that's one. Second, I think we need to be shining a light on this history to shift the conversation. Because right now, for the past, the anti-Zionist movement in the States basically got a pass on the history of anti-Zionism because we got caught up in a debate about, is it anti-Semitism? No, they're not Nazis, right? Yeah, but they're drawing from a non-Nazi tradition that was, that also was horrible for Jews, right? We'll talk about that. We gave them an easy way out because they said, no, we're not Nazis, we're anti-Semites. I think we need to stop with that and start focusing on the history of anti-Zionism around the world, and make sure that if people are using that label anti-Zionism now, you got to own it. You have to own that history. And it's not a pretty one.
Thank you. Thank you for that. Another, just, coming from the background of sociology, I am struck by the absolute absence, besides your work and very few others, using sociological lenses to look at anti-Zionism and anti-Semitism and just the othering of Jews. In fact, I had some students leave my class on whatever day is not today, I guess it would be yesterday, when we were talking about Patricia Hill Collins' concept of controlling images, right? And she wrote Black Feminist Thought and a bunch of other things. She's very highly regarded, especially in sociology departments and social sciences and any kind of, anti-racist or arena. And we had been watching the Myron Riggs documentary, Ethnic Notions. And, so I was making these connections between her concept, which is, different than a stereotype because it highlights how these are images of groups that serve to justify, and inequality serves to justify violence, serve to justify oppression. And I made the comment in class after we were discussing this documentary, which is fantastic and also really hard to watch, Myron Riggs' Ethnic Notions, that, as a piece of content analysis, we could use this idea of tracing material culture and, non-material culture and how it changes over time to justify inequality of the day, right? Or to justify to use different justifications depending on the current social and cultural moment. And then I couldn't help myself, because I'm me, And I said, it's so striking to me that you are able to see how all of these images that get perpetuated, whether it's as, Black American males as thugs, or American females or mothers as welfare queens or whatnot, how you can recognize that these are controlling images with all these different groups, but turn it toward Jews, right, or Israelis. All of this goes out the window. They're unable to turn that lens toward Jews, Israelis, or toward understanding how they're improperly using it. And so I made this comment in class, and like 4 students left my class, right? Because they were very unhappy that I said that. And then I followed it up by like, wow, for a group that is so heavily invested in smashing binaries, right? And I'm so appreciative that you brought up Mary Douglas's work. I love Mary Douglas's work. But this idea of like, smashing binaries and whatnot for this generation is high on their list of signaling and identity and all these things, but yet they are holding on to the binary of Zionist, anti-Zionist, or Jews are bad, or all of that. And I just find that contradiction and that irony really, really kind of striking. And then just one final thought about the Free Palestine thing. It brings to mind call and response and Black churches and whatnot. And so, these folks are no dummies. So they're using, just like you said, these kinds of rhetorical devices. And your point about it being so pervasive that even when it's on the individual level, somebody will shout it, even if there aren't others around, And I also just want to point out that this has repercussions also for Jews and Israelis. And this is going to sound a little bonkers, but right after at spring of, I guess it would be 24, my identical twin sister died of a drug overdose. And in praying and grieving, every time, I would say Kaddish, or every time, the word Yisrael came up in prayer, I heard in my excuse my language, I heard in my head, free Palestine, right? That is how entrenched it is. So I just wanted to share that. Yeah. So, but the bit about the binaries and the controlling images, like, just quickly, what do you make of that? And if it's not something we can talk about now, we can talk about it later, because I do want to move to other people's questions. I'm just so excited to talk to you.
I think we've all experienced that, and I think it's symptomatic of an academy that is, much better at turning the lens outward than using it to turn it inward. People don't like sociologists, and they don't like to be observed. And sociologists don't like sociologists when we turn the lens in and look at other sociologists. So, but I think that basically we need to be using the tools of the disciplines that are being, I hate the term weaponized, the terms of the disciplines that are being used that are using themselves to attack Jews. I think we need to use the same intellectual tools to critique those attacks on Jews. The people who are using them, some of them the ones who are intellectually honest will rethink. And the ones who are not, and they'll continue to do this. And what can you do?
It sounds like a panel in the making for the conference. So now I would like to turn it to the good people in the audience. First question. Well, I think you so you kind of addressed Emma's question. Emma asked, this is such a great presentation. My question is, how can we use your analysis to educate and persuade anti-Zionists or fellow travelers? Do you think there are reachable people who may disagree with Israel, but would also like to be involved, also wouldn't want to be involved in this kind of anti-Zionist movement if they understood the analysis? And so you spoke to that a little bit.
We don't need to talk about Israel when doing education about anti-Zionism. Just educate about the history of anti-Zionism on its own terms, and make sure it's out there, at all levels of the curricula, and also in public culture. We have lots of Holocaust movies. We have very few. Do we have any movies about oppression of Jews in the Soviet Union, or oppression of Jews in Iran or the like? Get some popular culture out there. It's not about anti-Semitism, and don't label it anti-Semitism. Just call it anti-Zionism. Use the terms that they're using. Soviets said it was anti-Zionism. Okay, I'll give them that.
Yeah, yeah. Thank you. And then I'm going to turn now to people. I'm going to move between the chat questions and some hands that are up. So I believe the first hand I saw up is that Arya?
Yes.
Yeah.
Hi.
Okay. Hi.
Thank you so much. This is incredible. So I'm a lawyer and I'm a PhD student at Graz, a new one, in the anti-Semitism studies. And one of the dilemmas that we're looking at, or I'm thinking about, is this intersection between like a deeply persuasive sociological explanation that you've provided around othering that gives us a way to go after places like the Othering and Belonging Institute, which is othering Jews, But when we get into the legal space and litigation, so thinking First Circuit decision and Stand With Us, how do you see translating this into our existing legal infrastructure that doesn't capture othering as hate? Because I did hear you make that distinction. So I'd love to hear a little bit more of how you would connect the socio-legal, the sort of interdisciplinary approach where we could take this and use this in the legal settings to combat what we're seeing.
Yeah. For that one, I will end up turning it back to you for the suggestions. This is what I recognize. This is one of the problems. We have a legal infrastructure that, in some cases, won't label it as if we're just looking at behaviors and actions. And then we have a whole infrastructure around the term anti-Semitism. And I'm here saying, you know what? Let's not use the term anti-Semitism. But if we build up a whole infrastructure around the term anti-Semitism, then what do we do with this? Anti-Zionism is a form of othering of Jews. It discriminates. It's all that stuff. But if our mechanisms only allow us to address the problem, if we call it anti-Semitism, then we have an issue. Maybe we don't focus on the labels and focus on the behaviors. But I'm not an attorney, so I know that in like how we fight this, we have to fight this in the legal realm as well. So I don't know if what I'm offering is going to be constructive and helpful, or if it's going to be, intellectually it makes sense, but it could be problematic for the legal battle. I don't know. I wish I had a better answer. I'm sorry, but I'd love to continue the conversation. I would really be interested to hear your thoughts.
Did you want to respond, Arya?
Yeah, so I appreciate that. And I think we don't have an answer yet, but I love the idea of really collaboration and, coming together to figure out new, because it is something new that we're facing. And maybe we need to get creative about how we're using the legal vehicles that we currently have to incorporate what I think is a very persuasive argument that you're making. I think it's like getting the lawyers and sociologists together to kind of craft something that can be persuasive to judges. So anyway, I'm going to let other people jump in. I don't want to take too much time, but would love to follow.
And to preempt any of the trolls who will comment, I noticed that the candelabra right behind me make it look like I have horns. But that's anti-Semitism, not anti-Zionism.
That's funny. Okay, Tammy, sorry about that. Please.
Yeah, hi. So I'm a PhD at Graz, Holocaust and Genocide Studies. I think I wanted to address the issue of the anti-Zionism being a separate thing. I don't think it is at all. And I think this is where some of us who work on contemporary anti-Semitism are quite wary of the attempts to make anti-Zionism its own field and its own thing. Anti-Zionism is a form of contemporary anti-Semitism, which, yes, is mostly on the left. But trying to pull away anti-Zionism from anti-Semitism, I think, is damaging to the work that we're doing to try to promote and fight anti-Semitism. I think this is a real issue, a real problem. And I know there's been the creation of MAS. I know Andrew's been promoting today his new Institute for the Study of Anti-Zionism. Why are we doing this? Is this going to be helpful? I don't think it is. I think that is this not just simply the manifestation of anti-Semitism? Once again, as has happened over centuries against the Jews. This is a new manifestation of Jew hate in different clothing. One of the things you said, for example, like we need equal time in the curriculum for anti-Zionism and not anti-Semitism. No, we need to teach anti-Semitism with Holocaust education. We don't do that currently. That's part of the problem. And that includes contemporary anti-Semitism, which includes anti-Zionism. I don't think doing this in the way that you're saying it is going to make everything work. You're saying anti-Zionism is worse than anti-Semitism. I don't agree with you. I think that these are not separate things here. And I think trying to separate them is trying to come up with something new and sexy to get people interested, but is not necessarily academically correct. So I guess that's my question. Why is there an attempt suddenly in the last couple of months to make this its own movement when everybody that's been working on contemporary anti-Semitism up to this point sees it as a form of contemporary anti-Semitism?
Yeah. All right, so you're making two arguments. One is a utility argument, and one is it academically, is it correctly analyzing what's happening? We can probably disagree on both of the issues for utility. If we want to talk about it from the question of utility, all of the Holocaust education, all the whatever anti-Semitism education we've done did not prevent a mass movement, an anti-Zionist mass movement from emerging in the States. So that's on utility. But on the intellectual, I'm not saying this because I think it's sexy. I'm saying this because this is how, as a sociologist, when I'm looking at the situation, this is what I'm seeing. I did not enter the field to study anti-Jewish stuff. When I first started teaching my sociology of Jewish American life, the only way that I taught about anti-Semitism was we read Philip Roth's Plot Against America. It was fictionalized. I was focused in the early 2000s much more on cultural creativity, the hybridity of diaspora, all that stuff. It was a very I missed what was going on. So yeah, I'm a Johnny-come-lately to the study of the othering of Jews. The way that I have seen and experienced the othering of Jews is that, for me, it makes more sense to me, that explains what I'm actually seeing right now, by thinking about it as anti-Zionism and not as a manifestation of 19th century German race science, which was different from the othering of Jews, that was theological and religious. So I don't see a single.
But Saul, let me ask you a really important. Can I ask you a really important question? Okay, and then I won't ask any more. But what you're doing is you're saying that anti-Zionism is left-wing. Anti-Semitism is an old form that's right-wing. And this is not the case. It's not the truth. It's not what we see happening today. We see those things together as forms of contemporary anti-Semitism. And the danger with that is you're saying anti-Zionism is the real problem. So because this other stuff is old stuff that we've already kind of talked about, and so how do we address Candace Owens? How do we address Nick Fuentes? These are as important to me as addressing anti-Zionism on the left, which is what I've been mainly focused on for the last number of years.
Yeah, I'm not saying that anti-Zionism is not a problem because it's old. I'm not saying that it's not a problem. I'm saying that if you want to think about how Jews are being othered and where it's coming from, where it's going to be institutionalized, where Jews are going to feel it most directly, and that has the professors behind it. You don't have the professors behind Candace Owens. People, we don't like. No,
you just have the president and groups that back him. I mean, what are we talking about here? You're talking about institutions. That's all I'm saying.
Right, and I said I want to repeat what I said. When I said that I think that anti-Zionism from the left is more dangerous for American Jews right now, I said that's right now, and that could change for exactly the reasons that you're talking about. But I don't see that as a manifestation of anti-colonial, anti-imperialist. This is a different type of politics. It's an othering of Jews that's rooted in something different, that has a different history. And I think that understanding the historical distinctions are going to be important for knowing that there's not one way of combating all. What Candace Owens is doing and what's happening on the campuses are different things. And if you're using fight Candace Owens strategies on the campuses, it's not going to work. And if you're using fight campus strategies on Candace Owens, it's not going to work. It's not going to work. The utility issue is not going to work because it's misdiagnosing and seeing them all as just part of the same phenomenon. The differences are actually they matter, and we need to understand them in order, one, to understand them, and two, to effectively fight them. But you know what? I have a feeling we're going to be in this conversation for a long time, and I'm looking forward to it because it's important. We want the same thing at the end. You just have to.
I know.
How to get there. Okay.
Right. Patricia?
Hi there, and hi, Shaul. It's good to see you.
Hi, Patricia. Hi, good to see you.
Good, yeah. So I'm a PhD out of Berkeley. Spent way too many years there. Did work in sociology of American Judaism. Moved from there into local politics, where I served a term on city council, and that's where I continued to work. In Alameda County, the home of UC Berkeley. It's fun in the anti-Zionist space, let me just say. So what I'm interested in, both as a sociologist and as currently someone fighting the good fight pretty loudly, is how we collaborate on that. How we work together to take this outside the academy, but also how we change within the academy. One of the things I saw at UC Berkeley was what I would consider the strong diminishment of sociology by claiming that with the school, one school of sociology claiming that you could observe and change at the same time, which is not science, it's ideology. So I have a lot of questions around sociology. I have a lot of questions around how sociology can inform the work that I'm currently doing. And then very specifically, so what you're talking about is something that I've been reading about, not within sociology, but in public spaces. So the work of Sarah Hurwitz, the popular work of Sarah Hurwitz and As a Jew, some of the work that Adam, I think Louis Klein, I'm not sure how you pronounce that, an anthropologist out of Canada is doing in the movement against anti-Zionism. Any comments on how that dovetails with what you're doing? And I would love to talk more about this offline.
Yeah, we'll end up talking about this offline as well. I would be interested in hearing your experience as someone who was involved in city council and seeing this on the political side. You bring the sociology and the political experience together, and I don't know who else does that. So you're in a unique position to actually be speaking to both. I'm only doing this from the sociological side, and it was only recently that we had some city council issues that we had to deal with here, which I went to, and I tried to bring that voice there. So I don't know that I have a direct answer. I just come back and hear Adam next week when he's speaking. He's doing great work, and I think it's really important because he's probably right now the most prominent public voice who is saying it is anti-Zionism. We just have to call it as it is, and we can't try to stigmatize anti-Zionism by labeling it anti-Semitism. Anti-Zionism is stigma enough, but we have to educate people on what the history of that movement is, and he's doing that in a way that's getting. I write long academic stuff, and he will too, but he's also getting things out there on social media. I'm not that type of an activist. I'm more, I'll sit back and I'll observe and I'll comment and offer some thoughts. I'll step up every once in a while to help out when needed, but I'm not out there doing it's not my Facebook feed.
Thank you. Patricia, did you want to respond?
Sure. Yeah, I do think that in some ways I'm in a unique place. Let me just say that when in my term on city council, I actually do have quite a bit to say about how to deal with local politics, which is largely from the we fix the streets standpoint. But that's a whole other, like I said, that's a longer conversation. I send you an email and maybe talk later, Shaul.
Sounds good.
Okay.
Thank you. Daniel.
Yeah, thanks. It's a really interesting talk, but could you clarify what you see as the relationship between anti-Zionist ideas and anti-Zionist activism? Because you spelt out anti-Zionist activism very clearly, And I also completely take your point that hate is a very narrow way of understanding this. It's a narrow psychological concept in this context. But there is a whole corpus of anti-Zionist ideas, much of it, as it happens, written by Jewish writers, unfortunately. And it seems to me that the core assumption is that, their assumption, not mine, is that Israel is the embodiment of what they see as the evils of modernity, the evils of Western civilization. That's how they see things. And it seems to me that what you've outlined as the activism is very much in line with. You seem to be suggesting there was some kind of contradiction. Maybe I misunderstood you.
Yeah, no.
So let me just finish my point. I don't see any contradiction at all, because, for example, if you have a boycott movement, which is basically designed to purge any kind of Jewish or Israeli influence from culture, from business, and so on, that's very much in line with the whole kind of eliminationist ideology of anti-Zionism.
Yeah, I don't think there's a contradiction. And I think that probably the main thing that the intellectuals are contributing is the legitimacy that this is coming with the stamp of PhDs behind it, that will allow people to think that they're doing something that is both morally good and not déclassé. And I think that's one of the reasons that anti-Zionism is more attractive to college students than right-wing race-based anti-Semitism. There's a social class distinction, and there's an intellectual snobbery, right? It's the Gushpanka, it's the seal of approval from the academy that this type of othering of Jews is legit. And so that the intellectuals they're playing an important role in producing that. They provide the legitimacy. I think that's the most important thing, even beyond the content of the ideas themselves, is that they provide that legitimacy that then let people go do things. But the writers themselves, what they will say is much more narrow than the behaviors that you'll see on the campuses. The behaviors that people will take up, they take on a life of their own. And so I'm not saying there's a contradiction. I'm saying there's a gap, that anti-Zionism is bigger than just what the intellectuals say it is.
And Melissa.
Hi, thank you for immensely useful presentation. I'm speaking actually as a Jewish theologian, not a sociologist, but it seems to me, and I think I'm echoing a number of people, that yes, there is a useful distinction to be made between anti-Zionism and anti-Semitism, but following on from perhaps Fania Oz and other commentators who look at one-state solution kind of anti-Zionism, and I know there are different kinds of one-state solution, but a one-state solution that actually calls for the exile or subjugation or murder of Jews, the theft of our infrastructure, the complete destruction of our sacra, never mind, the destruction of a whole Jewish polity, of Jewish sovereignty, that surely is rank anti-Semitism under another name. So what I'm saying is I think there's an important overlap, and I still can't quite see the point of binarizing the two.
Okay, so I think about this in terms of cultural toolkits. Every type of othering of Jews produces its culture, and once it's out there in the world, it's available to every other group. Right. And that's one of the reasons that, it doesn't matter, you're coming from the right, coming from the left, capitalist, communist, Islamist, you name it, Christian, Islamist, you see so many similarities because everything is thrown into the pot, and each different group can pick it up and mix and match it in the ways that they want to do. So, I think that what I'm pushing back against is a focus on labeling. We label this as anti-Semitism, and it's only a problem if we label it as anti-Semitism. And if we can't label it as anti-Semitism, then it's not a problem. That is certainly how anti-Zionists who are being labeled anti-Semites are pushing back to defend themselves. And I'm saying it's irrelevant. I don't care what the label is. If they're saying they're anti-Zionist, okay, I'll give them that label. Under that label, this is what I'm seeing. These are the behaviors that I'm seeing. These are the effects that I'm seeing. If you want to say, yeah, and guess what? There are similarities with other things, of course, because the cultural toolkit is out there, but it's the behaviors that are the issue, not the label that we attach to it. I think it's convenient. Convenience is the wrong word. I think it's useful to add into our repertoire of labels anti-Zionism as a label that captures a certain aspect of a certain thing of what's going on in the whole range of ways that Jews are othered. I think it's helpful to think about it because it lets us address something specific that we keep getting distracted from, or we're not able to fully think about as what's going on for itself. So that's why I think it's important. But I'm not wedded to, we must label it, and if we don't get the label right, then.
And just very briefly, though, I mean, important modern Jewish philosophers, Rosenzweig, Cohen, all sorts of people were anti-Zionists, and some anti-Zionists, Jewish anti-Zionists, want to identify real injustices or perceived oppression, and they're not anti-Semitic. So it's just a very broad church. Anyway, I won't take up any.
But like for Rosenzweig, I don't know that I wouldn't label anti-Zionist all lowercase with a non. He's engaging with Zionist thinkers. And
absolutely.
Like that's different. That you're not seeing engagement. If they might know Herzl, they might know Jabotinsky. But if they can't speak to go deeper into the canon of the classical Zionist thinkers, they're not engaged with them. That's not anti-Zionism, right? It's not about Zionism. It's its own thing. It's a protest movement that's othering Jews. And that's using a certain type of rhetoric and a whole set of behaviors to other Jews.
Thank you.
Thank you. I'm wondering if it might be useful to, just as we might do as sociologists, to make an analytical distinction between quote unquote structure and culture, even though there's massive overlap and they're mutually reinforcing. I'm wondering if we couldn't use a similar kind of frame to think about anti-Semitism and anti-Zionism, just to make that analytic distinction, even though they are mutually reinforcing. Jean or Jean, I can't see them. Yeah.
Hi. Well, I found it very interesting the way you presenting things, Shaun, and actually very, very helpful. But I agree with a lot of the things that Tammy was saying, and I'm a little bit confused, and there's kind of two parts to my question. And the first thing is that it is true, and we see this in London as well, that there are a lot of people out on the street campaigning, and they're not quite clear. They haven't read Herzl, etc. But they're not completely autonomous. The thing that unites them, excuse me, is that they see Israel as the epitome of evil. And I think that's why it's important to talk about Israel, because obviously Israel is the Zionist state. So whatever else people are focused around, the one thing that they do know is that they hate Israel. And I think the reason why it's important to connect anti-Zionism to anti-Semitism is because, as you say, they are disingenuous. If it was purely about anti-Zionism, then why are they attacking Jews in London? Why are they shooting Jews in Manchester? And, why are they attacking Jews across the US? Because in London, as far as I'm aware, and I lived for many years in Brooklyn, and I'm sure this is the case, people are not attacking Russians or Ukrainians for the Russian-Ukraine war. So I think that's what makes the connection and the idea of Israel as the only Zionist Jewish state and Jews as the top of this social hierarchy. But my second question is about how Islamism fits into your model, because I think sometimes when we think about Islamism, we think about it maybe in terms of the Middle East, maybe in terms of France, but Islamism is a real problem in the UK. And it's my understanding that it's also a problem in the US. So if you could just explain how Islamism fits in, because I'm not saying that the Islamists are the same as the what used to be called the progressive anti-Zionist Jews, but there is an overlap between them. So if you could kind of draw that out, that would be really helpful.
Yeah, certainly. Okay, so to the first point, when Jews are othered, historically, they tend to be portrayed as the opposite of whatever the society deems as good. Like we know this. This is not new. So right, and Middle Ages Christians see Jews as Christ killers, and that's why they're being othered. And when it shifts away from a society based on that to a society based around race, Jews are an inferior race. If among the capitalists, Jews are seen as being communists. Among the communists, Jews are seen as being representative of money. Whatever the good is, Jews are presented as the opposite of that. And we see this happening again, within the anti-Zionist movement, where Israel becomes then the epitome of colonialism, apartheid, you name whatever the evils are, and are posed against this. I think that's a continuity. I don't know what to label it. I don't like to label it anti-Semitism because I see anti-Semitism as a historically specific flavor or a mode of othering Jews and justification for othering Jews. I think that, what I like about the term othering of Jews is that it's talking about a process rather than ism, which is a thing. So the othering can happen in lots of different contexts, in different ways. They can be similar, they can be different. And you want to draw continuities. Yeah, the continuity between people on anti-colonialists who are looking at Israel as the epitome of colonialism and therefore evil and therefore to be opposed and therefore are killing people who they associate with Israel around the world. That's there are similarities to that with other ways that Jews are being treated. So I agree. With regard to Islamism, and I know that we're coming to time. Zionism is revolutionary. The notion that Zionism is Jews saying we are equal. We have the right. We are equal. We have the right to be equal, and we're dealing with world historical civilizations that for millennia assumed that they had the right to dictate whether Jews could have rights, privileges, or not. So that type of assertion of no, we have the right to be equal does not land smoothly all the time, and there's going to be pushback. And the pushback is going to be long and historical. And we're talking about millennia of oppression, and for Jews to finally say we have equal rights, cultures that had arrogated for themselves the right to define whether Jews, at most could be a dhimmi status, for example, or would be servants of the chamber in the Christian world. The notion that Jews have the ability to stand up and say, no, you don't get to decide whether Jews are equal. We're equal. There's pushback, and so part of the pushback, it gets framed in religious language because this is not this is not just a 20th century issue. There's deep structural power imbalances that Zionism was trying to overturn, and when you get that, the power structures will push back. That's it.
Sorry.
Yeah.
Yes, there are a few questions in the chat that I want to, if people have time to stick around, I think they're important to address. So one is, if you conceptualize anti-Zionism as a social movement, what is the role of Jews in it? What is the way for Jewish community workers from mainstream legacy organizations to respond to it? And this is a question from Ziama.
Mm-hmm. Repeat the first part of the question, please.
So I'm going to start from the very beginning. Great sociological talk as a Jew born in as a Jew born in 1979, and so in the Soviet Union, agree with Soviet anti-Zionism comments. It's her family history. You do not have time to mention Jewish anti-Zionism, not religious but left wing. So then, if you conceptualize anti-Zionism as a social movement, what is the role of Jews in it?
Yeah.
What is
Yeah,
the
that's
way
all.
for the Jewish community workers from mainstream legacy organizations to respond to it?
Yeah. So this is also one of the advantages. This is one of the reasons I think it's worth making a distinction between anti-Zionism and anti-Semitism. Anti-Semites don't have the asset of Jews who will identify with them as anti-Semites, and anti-Zionism does, and that's part that creates many more. It's an asset to the anti-Zionist movement, clearly, you know. So how for there there are some Jewish anti-Zionists who are probably true believers, you know, and the legacy organizations, they'll have no interest in listening to what legacy organizations have to say. But I would imagine that there are Jews who got involved in anti-Zionist mobilizations simply because they did not understand the history of anti-Zionism, and if they had, far fewer of them would have signed up for it. So again, it comes back to education about the history of anti-Zionism and what was done to Jews in the name of anti-Zionism. And what was done to Jews in the name of, I'm not anti-Semitic, I'm just anti-Zionist.
Thank you for that. A couple other questions from the chat. And Melissa asked a question earlier, and I want to make sure that your question was answered beyond what was in the chat. Okay. Karen writes that a close friend of 40 years just called her a fascist. This friend is highly intellectual and also a Unitarian Universalist member. Is anti-Zionism being talked about in the UU Church or other realms? And that is a question from Karen.
I don't know if it's being talked about in the and I don't know. I don't have the information to answer that intelligently.
Yeah, does anybody in the room have any insight? No, that's an empirical question. You can find out. And then Kathleen writes, as a German.
Oh, but sorry, but let me just add a comment to that. If you want to make the case that, well, it's this is why we shouldn't make a distinction between anti-Zionism and theological anti-Judaism, you know, if it's manifesting in churches, you know. So I really like to keep the ism terminology historically specific so that we can analyze the distinctions and come up with another terminology for the historical othering of Jews across time. You know, so yeah, are there connections between anti-Zionism and pre-anti-Semitic theological anti-Judaism in both Christianity and Islam? Yes.
Thank you. Question or comment from Rena. I question why we still use the term anti-Semitism, especially when you look at its origin. The term was coined by Wilhelm Marr, who founded the League of Anti-Semites in 1879, the first political organization in Germany created specifically to combat the alleged threat posed by Jews to German culture and society. It's like if the official term for hatred against Black people were a word invented by the Ku Klux Klan, and that is from Rena.
Yeah, you know, that's it's a problem. Yeah, maybe that's also one of the reasons that that scholars drop the hyphen from anti-Semitism, you know, to say this is not about whatever Marr said about Semites. This is about Marr.
Yeah. And then Kathleen, I'm going to read one more from the chat, and then I'm going to call on Max, and then I think I will make some announcements. But I want to make the announcements, and then if people are able to and want to hang out to chat, we can do that. But I want to make sure I get my announcements out there. Okay, so Kathleen writes, as a German non-Jewish observer, I wonder how American Jewish people, especially young ones, are fitting into these anti-Zionist movements, which some of them seem to join. Is it a topic within the Jewish community since young people might turn away from Zionism more because of it?
Yeah, it's certainly a topic within, and I think what part of the issue is that it's so divisive that people are not talking to each other. So I don't know that there's you know that there's a good understanding by people who there's not a good understanding of Zionists of how Jews who are joining an anti-Zionist movement understand what they're doing, and I don't think there's necessarily a good understanding among the anti-Zionists of why this is so upsetting and troubling to the majority of Jews in the country.
Thank you. And then Max, if you
Thank
want
you.
to start.
Can you hear me?
Yes.
Yes.
Okay, I've just activated a photo
Wait, is that Mark?
because I've got a camera attached.
Either.
I the point which came up was continuity and what historical continuity and how to label it. And I think it would be very helpful to locate it within what Nierenberg calls anti-Judaism, going right back to the early Egyptian times through to today, and then we can see how it fits into the continuity. I found the talk very helpful and very interesting, but it needs to be integrated in this history of ideas. Because otherwise we fail to understand it. And then if we bring in what, for instance, Rabbi Sachs or Deborah Lipstadt called a virus, if we use this as a metaphor, and then we have to ask the question, what made the virus become active on the 7th of October?
Mm-hmm.
And if we do that, I think we might get a wider grip on the whole question. And I'm currently trying to get together for myself what made it go viral.
Yeah. Yeah, I accept the point about think about it in terms of Nuremberg and anti-Judaism, right? And I think yes, of course, this needs to be integrated into deeper intellectual history. This is a particular this is a particular moment and place in which Jews are being othered. The cultural toolkit that the group is drawing on has a history, and the history does not. It goes back to the Soviet Union, but what happened in the Soviet Union also has a history. And that goes back to other places as well. It goes back to Marx. Marx is in Germany in the 1800s, right? He's getting stuff. Where's that coming from? And that goes back further as well. So if you want to say anti-Judaism, fine. I don't want to get it into the, whatever as we label it. That's not the point. There are historical continuities. We want to understand how there are historical continuities. We want to understand how each moment is unique and distinct at the same time. I'm not keen on the virus metaphor. Because metaphors are tools for thinking. And as a sociologist, I don't find a medical metaphor to be a helpful one. I find cultural toolkit to be a better one, because if people are creating stuff, they're throwing things into a box that other people, a toolkit that other people can use to create. And one of the reasons that we think, how did this get activated in October of 2023? Were it not for social movement activists, there would not have been the protests that we have seen. The notion this is a spontaneous eruption of the population because they were morally outraged or what have you is nonsense. There were organizers who called people out to the streets, who got people to come, and who provided language and symbols and the like. And then afterwards, the snowball begins to roll down the hill by itself, but you cannot ignore the role of activists. And when you think about it with the metaphor of a virus, you miss all of that type of human collective action. So I'm going to say, as a sociologist, I'm committed to sociology as having frameworks to help us explain this.
I have the advantage of not being a sociologist. We could now talk for quite a long time about how I use the term virus, but I think let's leave it at that for the time being.
All right. Good. Thank you.
So thank you everyone for coming today. Like I said, I'll leave the room open, and if Shaul has ability to hang out, we will hang out.
Yeah, I can stay on for a bit. Thank you. Thank you, everyone.